Welcome to Unmasking the Trans Movement with John Mueller. I'm your host, Brad Wilder. Today on the show, part 2 with Tracy Shannon. She has a compelling story to tell as a trans widow. We'll be back with John and Tracy for part 2 right after this.
Join Unmasking the Trans Movement with John Mueller Sunday, April 23rd at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time as he hosts Unmasking the Trans Movement's next webinar, where we connect you with the clinical professionals who provide understanding on the many topics that make up this disturbing ideology and answer any questions you may have. Protecting the most vulnerable, women and children. Unmasking the Trans Movement. For more info on guests, dates, times, and pricing, see us online at unmaskingthetransmovement.com.
Welcome back. Today, John Mueller sits down for part 2 with Tracy Shannon, a trans widow who has, bounced back. John, you've got so much to get through. A lot was discussed in part 1. I know you always want people to go back and watch part 1, but let's move straight into part 2. Let's not recap part 1 because I want to make sure we get everything in here in part 2, okay?
Brad, thank you, and welcome back to Tracy Shannon. Tracy's story is one that needs to be told because her story is reflective of so many now. The trans movement or the trans deception has unleashed these kind of stories time and time again because it has given permission to very narcissistic and self-centered, redundant, but very deviant men who have decided and have used this ruse as cover for being able to now find plausible excuse to come out. And it's important at the outset, we are not against any group of people, but it's also important for people to understand there's no such thing as trans. There's no trans kids, there's no trans adults. There are people. There are men and women, boys and girls, some of whom have become confused, but with the adults, especially with men, many of them have become sexually deviant because they've become porn saturated. And now they have found a convenient excuse, perfect cover, to be able to flaunt and go into whatever they want. And the wives, like Tracy, they're left to pick up the pieces. Their lives are shattered. They're sent into a tailspin, and their kids are forever scarred. And that's where we left off last time. Tracy, thank you again for coming back, because you were just sharing with the lifelong implications you're still living with and having to pick up the pieces. Still, on behalf of your kids, you remarried, but this thing is still in your life. So talk to us about, give us some additional insight into, for those of us that are not having to walk in your shoes, because I am tired of this narrative of these deviant men getting off the hook because they flipped the script, and we've got these misplaced sympathies for these guys in heels when in fact they are narcissistic. They were husbands that abandoned their promise. They flaked and they went into porn-saturated deviance. And no, they are not deserving of our sympathies. These are the ones that are unfaithful, and they left in their wake broken and shattered lives. And we are here to feature you. You and other trans widows are the heroes, but this is a battlefield that is strewn with the heartbreak from this grand deception. So talk to us. What other things would we not, as the general public, that we would not conceptualize or understand that you're having to live with, you and your kids and your extended family?
Right. First of all, when it comes to extended family, my parents were about to retire when all of this happened. And they certainly were not thinking that they were going to have to deal with helping take care of me and my kids right when they were ready to enjoy their retirement. My ex-husband left me and the kids homeless because I had not been working for 10 years. I was a stay-at-home mother and I homeschooled my kids. And so not only
Tracy, when you say, and this is important for people to know, because these guys come across as sensitive men. So you indicated he left you homeless. Define that.
I could not afford any place to live. I had to go move in with my parents, who luckily lived close by so that I could do that. Because if they didn't, I would have been in a shelter, because you're not allowed to move out of the county when you're going through a divorce. You have to stay in the county you live in. So if it weren't for that, I would have been on the streets. And we ended up sharing one room in my parents' home for a little while until I could share another room became available in their home, because we had to rearrange how they were living, so that my daughter and I stayed in one room and my two boys stayed in another. And after a year and a half of that, my parents did retire, and I rented their house from them for a couple of years. So they weren't planning on having to help support us financially and put a roof over our heads. I am very fortunate and blessed that they were able to help me during that time, but that's not something they were planning on. They worked their whole lives and were ready to retire to their little fishing house, and it was completely unfair to them. Thankfully, they were there for me. People don't realize just what this does to the children. They were going to school, and knowing their family's different is one thing. We always hear how we're supposed to accept other people's families, how they look differently than our own. Well, that's not what my kids wanted. They didn't want people to accept that their dad was dressing up as a woman, because they themselves don't want to accept that. They just wanted their dad back. And they would feel really bad when there was like a father-daughter, father-son event at school, because they wanted their dad to be involved, and they didn't want to hurt me. So they wouldn't come and tell me, hey, there's this event, because I would have had my dad go. I would have had my grandpa go, but they wouldn't even tell me. So they would just quietly hurt and cry. But the LGBT community is always talking about how suicidal that these so-called trans people are. And the reality is, when this happens to a family, the children, they feel like hurting themselves. And between my 3 children with my first husband, there were 6 suicide attempts of different levels of seriousness, and one child had to be put into a facility for a little while to address that issue, and many years of counseling with the older children. So, and for myself, I went to counseling for a little bit, did not continue that, and probably will again go back here later in this year to deal with some of the things that just haven't been dealt with. And I'm unearthing still to this day, because you do not know how this will affect you until you've lived your whole life. And my children don't know how this will affect them until they've lived their whole lives, because that's how deeply it affects a child when the father ghosts them like this. And like for me, in a new relationship, and my husband is a wonderful person who took on a lot that he didn't have to take on. And he knew he would be taking that on. I was in complete denial. I'm like, I don't have any baggage. And if I do, it's all cute and it matches, but there definitely is baggage, because when you experience things in relationships that can look or feel similar to what you felt in your marriage with the ex as a trans widow, maybe that's, whatever issue's going on, it could feel like that to you, but it isn't like that. So you're having to ask yourself all the time, is this really happening? Or is this just, I'm feeling this way and seeing it through the lens of what I experienced before? And
which is really a good description, Tracy. This is what you just described is trauma. It's PTSD.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you have to make sure that you're not putting the person that you love now in a bad light that they don't deserve. And you still have real stress that has to be addressed. And that person is a saint to deal with all of that, because you cannot just trash a new marriage with a healthy person because of the past. And so there's a lot of work that has to be done for us, that we have to recognize that going forward. It's very hard, because you came out of a marriage that you don't feel responsible for what happened, but now you do have some work to do, because you were so gaslighted in that marriage, and you couldn't believe your own eyes. And so now you're conditioned to question, is everything okay here? Is everything really okay here? When's the next, when is the other shoe going to fall? So you do have some mental things that you'll need to work with. And unfortunately for trans widows and their children, we don't trust the mental health profession. I mean, these are the people that told me I must be a lesbian. These are the people that wrote the letter for my ex-husband to get on hormones behind my back for 11 years. That had a lot of consequences for my marriage and for me personally that made me question my own self and my own value as a woman. Because obviously when a man is on estrogen, things happen to his body that does affect the intimacy in the marriage. And so I naturally thought it must be me. It must be me. And of course, our haters will definitely try to tell me it is me. And any problems with my kids, that's me too. So they're there to continue that narcissistic abuse. Even though you've kicked that narcissist out of your life, those people want to keep abusing you. See, the people who are telling you need to be compassionate, they have no empathy at all. And in fact, whenever I was leaving him, and still to this day, when I say the reason for our divorce, people will say, "Oh, well, at least he can be happy now." Like I was trying to prevent him from being happy.
Skip. Yeah, it's all about him.
Yeah. I mean, it's so. It's just narcissism has just been so widely accepted, and it's awful how we've been trained to prioritize adult fulfillment over what children need and over the commitment to marriage. Now, I'm not saying this because I'm still in love with my ex or anything like that, but I will admit, had we been able to make our marriage work, that would have been the best thing for our kids. And who knows, maybe the best for us, even though I cannot imagine loving him the way I love my current husband, which is, I can't imagine loving anyone more than I love my current husband. But, I will admit that divorce, no matter how great things are when you move on, it's just so harmful. And with this element of your ex pretending to be somebody else and bringing all these individuals into their lives. I mean, my kids were abused by my ex's female to male lover, who is who's been an activist, a prominent activist with groups like Equality Texas and Human Rights Campaign in Texas. And these are people we're listening to about don't harm these trans kids. Like, what about my kids? Nobody gave a damn about them. In fact, we couldn't get their counselor, who was court ordered, to even help them with their grief. Instead, when they went to this court-ordered therapy, they were coached on what pronouns to use. And you can't call your father dad anymore. And they should have been the priority, not their father, but they were secondary. The whole idea of just using these kids as an accessory to your lifestyle is disgusting, and it needs to stop. And they need to start thinking about the women who are affected by this, because we were being manipulated. My ex was watching me put on my makeup. I thought he wanted to talk to me while I was doing my makeup. I thought he enjoyed my company. No, he was just learning how to be me. If we could put a picture up side by side, and you would see that he was trying to look like me. And, he got a nose job. So he had a nose like mine. I mean, we hear all the time from the left about somebody colonizing, that we're colonizers in the West. Well, how about a man colonizing a woman? Because that's what this feels like. And I'm tired of them getting all this sympathy. And corporate America can just take their Bud Lights and shove them where the sun doesn't shine. Because I was discussing, they're putting this man, who pretends to be a woman and mocks womanhood. I mean, are we going to start having corporate America start celebrating the minstrel shows now? Because it's the same thing.
And Tracy, let someone attempt to assert right now, oh, there goes Euler and his guests, or that we're anti. Now, I'll tell you what, the other part of my life, I work with men who have sexually offended. And what you told us on the first half of this episode is that when your kids went over, so the separation has taken place, or when the divorce happened, but your kids are reporting back that they found sex toys. Your daughter reported to you that your ex, so her father, when he was doing this cross-dressing stuff and being around deviant individuals, sexually deviant individuals that you had no clue who they are, what their background is. When a man gets into pornography, he opens the door into all sorts of heinous stuff in this day and age. And they become profoundly adept liars. And so you can't trust what's coming out of their mouth. So all you know is you're entrusting him. You're hoping that his paternal instincts are going to be still protective, but they're coming back and they told you that they saw sex toys out. And if any of the guys in my groups were to say, well, I just happen to have a sex toy out, I'd say, really? So you just leave sex toys around when your kids are coming over? You just forgot? Anything else you want to try to tell me? You want to tell me how reasonably intelligent you are, but you forgot you had a sex toy out? Really? Then you were talking about...
That, yeah, and restraints. The kids found restraints on the bed. Like, I'm sure they wondered, why does Dad have these, like, restraints on the bed?
He accidentally forgot that. He didn't know his kids were coming over. He doesn't clean up. Oh, I missed picking up the restraints. Really? So you want me to believe that
sleep there,
right? You want me to believe that a reasonably intelligent man forgets and plays brain dead? No, he can't have it both ways. That was intentional. This guy was grooming his kids to lower their boundaries, to lower their awareness, to little by little lower their inhibitions. You said that he brought his pornography out, so he couldn't wait, meaning he literally couldn't restrain himself, pardon the pun. He couldn't wait until his kids, that he has joint custody, that he was so addicted to porn that he had to use porn while his kids were on visitation, joint custody, but he didn't do it in his own bedroom. He brought it out to where your daughter was. If any of the men in my sex offender treatment said that to me, I would ask them, repeat that, help that make sense so that it doesn't look what it looks like. These guys plan on and they play upon our goodness to give them the benefit of the doubt. Yet when your husband, when you had continued, your ex, when he was with you and he was working you as far as gaslighting you and manipulating you, what did he do each time when you gave him the benefit of the doubt?
Well, he would continually violate my trust. So things might
he was
seem
deceptive.
good for a while.
He was deceptive.
I mean, people don't realize just how there's just a lot of boundary bashing. There's a lot of just putting yourself first for these men and just forgetting that the world doesn't revolve around you. And safeguarding's just been turned on its head to be polite and give, like men the benefit of the doubt. I mean, specifically talking about men going in women's restrooms. I mean, this is an issue that women are talking about, they're concerned about, but then you have these women who are like, oh, well, if they pass, where are they supposed to go? It isn't a matter of if you pass, you're a man. We don't want a man in the women's restroom because that makes women less safe. It doesn't matter how well you pass. A completely dangerous man could still pass. And we don't want them in our female-only spaces. If they're trying to just act like it's okay, these handmaidens need to knock it off. And all these men who support that, the very ones who support all that, they're the ones sending me pornography whenever I speak out. And I check my inbox on message requests on Twitter or Facebook, and I'm getting sent all this porn from these, harmless, so-called trans women who just want to pee next to me in the bathroom.
To those that want to question us whether or not we're being too harsh, I should invite them to be a fly on the wall during sex offender treatment, to listen to these sensitive guys, the same ones that are sitting in my group. A number of them were arrested for voyeurism, for going into women's restrooms, for putting cameras in as well. You notice when we see online the opposite sex that's in the opposite sex restroom, we don't see a lot of girls that are now dressing as boys, as young ladies dressing as men. We don't see them taking pictures of themselves. It's always the guys dressed up as girls taking pictures of themselves. People need to understand it is not a minor issue when a guy's doing that. He is sending forth a message. He's conquered, he's violated these spaces, and he's sending a message. He's preening. And that's why we also see multiple videos online of these different guys that are masturbating while in the same restroom with women. You can see the women in the background. So it is, people need to understand that's okay, Tracy. You are a mom, right? You're trying to run a household, and you're being good enough to to spend your time with us. So bless your heart. And again, that shows the ongoing impact that, bless their hearts, your kids are still trying to figure out what's normal, how to adjust, and it's this ongoing pain. And you got remarried, and you were mentioning that, it doesn't end. The challenges and the how in the world is, step families are difficult enough, right? The divorce rate for second marriages are twice that for original, the first for first marriages. But then to have this kind of stuff, it's got to be overwhelming.
Yeah, I think the statistic really depends on, the quality of person that you married. My husband and I, we're very committed to our marriage. Even through rough times, I have a very painful disease that makes it hard for me and him. And then we have all these things, which has resulted in, stuff just being heavier with the kids, and who, if you saw them today, you'd say, well, they don't look so bad to me, but they're still navigating things of their own. You had mentioned that these men, voyeurism and that sort of thing. And it just reminded me of how media covered very widely Sam Britton stealing the clothing, stealing the luggage. Well, I was in a support group with a lot of women, like over 200 women many years ago, whenever I just thought my ex had a little cross-dressing problem. And many of those women shared that their husbands were, doing voyeurism in the neighborhood, or had stolen clothes from the local laundromat, or even stolen women's clothes when they went to dinner at a friend's house, at their apartment or something. So there's just this absolutely deviant behavior, and all of these women and men who are making excuses for them and saying that they're completely harmless, and that they're very empathetic. Like, how is that empathetic? And that's one of the things that really weird counselor tried to convince me of, that because my ex dressed up in women's clothes, that somehow he would be more understanding of me as a woman. He would be more empathetic. It's just so irritating. And for me, I've had to speak out because I see this whole movement has just increasingly encroached on the family, increasingly harmed children to where they're having surgeries at young ages, and ruining their sterility, ruining their sex lives forever, and just having a future of no hope and being medicalized forever. And I just cannot stay silent, because I know just how unethical and unprofessional this movement is. I know how it harms families. And one thing that I like to say is, if you want to know how this movement will affect you as an individual, even if your family member does not transition, ask a trans widow, because we know for how institutionally it'll be handled. We know from going to court that you'll be coaxed to use their pronouns. We know that you'll be made to divorce a woman on paper, like I was, and that was over a decade ago. There won't be any empathy or compassion for you, because this whole ideology is like a religion, is being prioritized in our society all over the world. And your rights won't be respected, and don't expect rights to be respected when we're not anchored to the truth, because you cannot have liberty, you cannot have justice if you're not anchored to the truth. So the state needs to not come into agreement with a lie, and we need to quit acting like there's the ability for that movement to have compassion and empathy for women, because it cannot. And it doesn't even have compassion and empathy for children, and it will not have any for you. And don't wait to stand up against it, when it comes. Don't wait for it to hit your front door. You need to stand up against it now. The time to stand up is now, not when it hits your family.
When you say stand up, one of the questions that I have, there's a lot of trigger signs that happened as this was all starting to manipulate and come into your realm. Was your ex-husband very flamboyant? Did he have that personality? Was he Or was he just like a beta male, just kind of quiet, passive, subdued, but narcissistic, I
Yeah.
guess?
He was emotionally manipulative, and he was very passive, and he was also passive aggressive, and he didn't take responsibility for things in the relationship. If he had hurt feelings, he would just be passive. And one example that I remember, now I look at it and say, why didn't I see that as a sign? He was upset at his mom and dad and said that they weren't calling him. They weren't talking to him. I said, what do you mean they're not talking to you? And he said, well, they haven't called me. And it was a number of weeks, and he was hurt about it and kind of acting victimized to me. And I just said, well, just call them. And I kept pushing him till he did, because I was like, why have a rift? Just pick up the phone. And, he would make like that. So that was one example. And then I realized later he did that to me. He would say, I'm hurting him. I'm not giving the affection or the attention. And he was telling other people that I'm just this horrible wife. For example, we went to a family picnic, and he had recently had a haircut. He had let his hair grow, and he got this kind of mushroom looking haircut. It looked a little feminine. And I didn't like it because, of course, I knew about his cross-dressing at home. And in front of family members who had said, oh, I like your hair, because, of course, they noticed it. They probably didn't really like it, but they were caught looking right at it. So they had to say something. So like, oh, I like your haircut. Oh, see, Tracy, everyone likes it but you. So he was just gaslighting me in front of everyone, making me look like this, asshole, really, that, was demanding that he keep his hair at half an inch short or something. And that wasn't really the case. He tried to make it like I was this control freak about his hair, when in reality, it had a real reason to be concerned about him growing his hair out in a manner that he might be using it in his cross-dressing secretly, because that was a real turnoff to me. So, I think people just don't realize that this can happen with really masculine men. A lot of men are doing this who have been in the military and are very alpha male. I mean, because it's a fetish, and a fetish can hit anybody. You don't have to be a feminine guy or have, so-called feminine characteristics or mannerisms. Any guy can get into this. Look at some of these guys online that are super buff that decide they're going to do this. It's a fetish, and it's a mind thing. It's they weren't born that way, but they get into it, and I guess they just can't stop.
Well, and ever since the 1980s, this is reflective of what they're looking at. I do want to mention to any woman that is listening, if your man is dressing in women's underwear, we want to assume that he purchased those. I have been working with sex offenders for 14 plus years. And I want people to understand, I want the general public to understand, by the time a man is dressing women's underwear, more than likely he's stealing them, and it makes him very dangerous. He's morphing into a degree of sexual psychopathy. At the end of that is very dark and deviant stuff. By the time a man is wearing women's underwear, he's much more deviant than people want to know. That's the stark reality. We're placing women and children in harm's way, at risk. That's why these men, you want to see them ignite. You want to see them get energized. You want to see them give pushback. You want to start seeing them yell, kill TERFs. We put boundaries on them. And what happens? Kelly J. Keene almost lost her life with his rabid mom, quite frankly, in New Zealand, because she was simply holding a rally, said, let women speak. Deviant men are fast-tracked because of pornography and the internet. And what they are showing us is only half of what they are accessing behind the scenes. And pornography, once it becomes deviant, it will create a deep malevolence from a man to a woman. And that's why he puts his hand on her throat. And they transition down further from barely legal into child porn. And the reason they hate women is women will act as the last barrier between them between the deviant man and the children they want to access.
This is
People
part of
need to
your
understand
9
this.
flags, is it not, John? Part of your 9 red flags?
It's part of the 9 red flags, absolutely, and especially what the kids evidence. And what's so damaging and dangerous about those pushing the trans agenda, the trans deception, the narrative, is when you have a therapist or mental health professionals or doctors or mandated reporters, and that's where that's the focus, the mandated reporters, if they are trained to reinterpret, and it's really dumbing them down, that if they're trained to reinterpret the 9 red key clinical indicators, the red flag indicators of sexual trauma in terms of gender confusion, then we have silenced the lambs. And we do a disservice to kids because we don't know then how many of them are being perped on. And that's why this is a matter of child safety. It's a matter of safety of women. Guys that want to get into women's sports teams and women's prisons, these deviant men that want to get in there are wanting to access their private spaces. And Tracy, I know, let me give you the last word. We're up against the clock. Speak to what I just said, and then any wives that are listening, what are some last words?
Well, I think it's very telling whenever a woman speaks up about the harms of the transgender movement and the harm that a man has done to her and her kids, that she sent pornography by a bunch of men that hate women. They obviously just hate women. And I think this whole movement is driven by hate. And they're always calling anyone that calls them out or questions the wisdom of what's being done to children and to families in the name of this movement. They're always calling us haters, but this is a hate-filled movement. You don't love anybody, especially children, if you're trying to encourage them to mutilate their bodies and sterilize themselves. That is no way to be an ally to a child. That is not loving them. That is not loving a man or a woman who is gripped by this confusion, fetish, and this whole ideology. That's not loving them. You love people by telling them the truth, sometimes firmly. And I agree with what John said earlier. None of us here hate anybody. I don't have the energy to hate anybody, so it's clearly not where this is coming from. But I have a right to speak about my experience, and my experience is valid. The left loves to say that their experience is valid. Well, my experience is valid. It's not a one-off. And you'll be hearing, I think, as we go on, from more people who've been hurt by this movement, because they're not going to be silenced. And I think John captured it when he said, you're silencing the lambs. That's what's happening.
Tracy, thank you. Thank you for being willing to be vulnerable with us and to share what needs to be shared. It is not deviant men that need our sympathies. It is those that have been betrayed, those that are being harmed. So thank you. Brad, and thank you as always. These are difficult discussions, but this is the truth as we unmask the trans movement.
Protecting the most vulnerable among us, women and children. We started that for that reason. And this is coming at parents, grandparents, wives from all different directions. You think it maybe is just happening in your school. It can be happening in your bedroom and in your house too. The proof is there. The pornography is the problem, and there's no question in my mind about that. With that, we'll wrap up today. Remember, we're on BitChute. We're also on YouTube now. You can find all of our episodes there. They're absolutely free. You can also sign up, become a member under unmaskingthetransmovement.com. We'll get you all the information you need to help parents, grandparents, and even trans widows alike. We have so much to get to as we move forward. Remember, it's not our kids' fight, it's our fight.